Welcome to tonight's sleep story. This tale will be accompanied by the gentle sound of rain to help you drift off to sleep. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Leave a comment below. It's fascinating to see how our community spans different time zones, all united in seeking a peaceful night's rest. Now, make yourself comfortable, adjust your volume, and let the rain and story guide you into peaceful dreams. Our story begins. The divorce papers lay unsigned on Emma Richardson's kitchen table for 3 months before she finally found the courage to sign them. James had moved on quickly enough. Last she heard, he was living with his research assistant in a cozy Boston apartment, their shared dreams of academic success now his alone to pursue. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. She had been a research assistant once too, back when they first met at the university. Now, at 34, with a master's degree in history gathering dust and student loans piling up, she found herself staring at a job listing that seemed almost too perfect to be true. Night custodian needed at historic Blackwood Academy. Background in history or architecture preferred. The interview had been strange from the start. Mrs. Henderson, the school's administrator, conducted it in her office on the first floor of the imposing Victorian building. The elderly woman's eyes kept darting to the ceiling throughout their conversation, as if tracking something moving above them. The golden afternoon light streaming through the tall windows caught the dust motes in the air, making them dance like tiny stars. The night shift can be challenging, Mrs. Henderson had said, her fingers nervously adjusting her pearl necklace. We've had trouble keeping staff. People find the isolation difficult. She paused, studying Emma's face. Your background in historical research is intriguing. May I ask what your thesis was about? Architectural symbolism in 19th century educational institutions, Emma replied, watching as Mrs. Henderson's face paled slightly. I focused on how builders incorporated esoteric and mystical elements into seemingly conventional designs. How appropriate, Mrs. Henderson murmured. She glanced at the ceiling again, then back at Emma. Tell me, Ms. Richardson, do you believe in coincidences? Before Emma could answer, a sound echoed from somewhere above them, like footsteps, but somehow wrong, as if they were walking on a different surface than the building's wooden floors. Mrs. Henderson acted as if she hadn't heard anything. The position is yours if you want it, she said quickly, shuffling papers on her desk. You'll work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. The day staff will show you the basics of the cleaning routine. But, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, you'll have considerable autonomy in how you organize your time. Just stay alert, and perhaps avoid the third floor until you've settled in. Emma should have asked why. She should have pressed for details about the strange warning in Mrs. Henderson's voice. Instead, she found herself accepting the position, driven by a curiosity she couldn't quite explain and a need to start fresh that overwhelmed her usual caution. That night, lying in her bed in her small apartment, Emma dreamed of corridors that stretched into infinity and doors that opened onto impossible spaces. She woke with a start, her heart racing, the echo of footsteps still ringing in her ears. On her nightstand, her phone showed 3 missed calls from James. She deleted them without listening to the voicemails. Her first week at Blackwood Academy was deceptively normal. The day shift custodians Maria, Tom, and Hector showed her the ropes, which cleaning products to use on the antique woodwork, how to properly mop the marble floors in the entrance hall, where to find extra supplies. They were friendly enough, but Emma noticed how they never mentioned the third floor, how their eyes would skip over it when discussing the building's layout. It was Hector, the oldest of the group, who finally broke the unspoken rule. He caught her alone in the supply room on her 5th day, his weathered face serious in the fluorescent light. You're not just a cleaner, are you? He asked quietly, his accent thick with his native Honduras. I see how you look at the building. You understand about places like this. Emma hesitated, then nodded. There's something wrong with the 3rd floor, she said. It wasn't a question. Hector's face creased with worry. Wrong? No, senorita. Wrong is too simple. That floor, it's like a wound that never healed properly. And tonight, he glanced at his watch. Tonight is the dark of the moon. Be careful. The echoes are strongest when the moon hides her face. Before Emma could ask what he meant, Maria called for him from the hallway, and he hurried away, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts and the faint sound of footsteps from somewhere above. That night, as she pushed her cleaning cart past the second-floor science labs, Emma made a decision. She would explore the third floor. Her academic training demanded investigation, documentation, understanding. But as she approached the stairwell that would take her up, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting to see what she would do. The stairs creaked under her feet as she ascended, each step feeling somehow longer than it should be. The air grew colder as she climbed, and by the time she reached the third-floor landing, she could see her breath misting in front of her. The hallway stretched out before her, lit by fluorescent tubes that seemed to flicker more than they should. Something about the proportions felt wrong. The doors were slightly off-center from where they should be, and the corridor itself seemed longer than the building's dimensions should allow. Emma took a deep breath and stepped forward. The sound of her footstep echoed back to her, but not quite in sync with her movement. It came a fraction of a second too late, as if the sound had to travel much further than the confines of the hallway would suggest. She took another step, another echo, still delayed, but this time, she thought she heard something else. A second set of footsteps, very faint, moving somewhere ahead of her in the darkness where the lights had yet to activate. The motion sensors clicked on one by one as she advanced, creating a wave of illumination that revealed empty classroom after empty classroom. But something was odd about the rooms too. Through the windows and the doors, she could see that some contained modern desks and computers, while others seemed frozen in time, with antique furniture and chalkboards covered in faded writing. She stopped in front of one such room 3 to 14, and peered through the glass. The desks inside were from the Victorian era, their surfaces scarred with generations of carved initials. A piece of chalk sat on the ledge of a blackboard, and as Emma watched, it began to roll, seemingly of its own accord. Behind her, the echoes of her last footstep finally faded away. In the sudden silence, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The distinct sound of chalk writing on slate, coming from inside the locked classroom. Emma's hands trembled as she fumbled with her master keys, trying to find the right one for room 3 to 14. The scratching sound continued, chalk moving across the blackboard with deliberate purpose. Through the window, she could see the white lines forming, but from her angle, she couldn't make out what was being written. Finally, the key turned. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. The chalk dropped to the ledge with a tiny clink that somehow sounded like a thunderclap in the unnatural silence. On the blackboard, in elegant Victorian handwriting, were the words, "They're watching you too, Emma." The temperature in the room plummeted. Emma's breath came out in white clouds as she approached the blackboard. Below the message, in smaller writing, was a set of numbers. November 15th, 1873. The date Elizabeth Blackwood disappeared. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room. Impossible, given that the windows were sealed shut, and the pages of an old book on the teacher's desk began to flutter. Emma approached cautiously, her historian's instincts warring with her fear. It was a diary, bound in faded leather, its pages yellowed with age. The diary fell open to a specific page, and Emma found herself reading. November 10th, 1873, Father's behavior grows more erratic by the day. I found his secret notes about the building's design. This was never meant to be just a school. The geometric patterns, the precise measurements, the alignment with celestial bodies. He's trying to create something he calls a resonance chamber. The local tribes warned him about disturbing this place, but he wouldn't listen. Now I hear them at night, the echoes that aren't echoes. They're getting closer. I've discovered something in the library's restricted section, an old text that speaks of thin places where the membrane between worlds has worn down. The indigenous people who lived here built their sacred sites to strengthen these barriers, but Father's designs are doing the opposite. He thinks he's opening a door to higher knowledge, but he doesn't understand what's waiting on the other side. The students are starting to notice. 3 of them came to me today, speaking of whispers in empty rooms, of footsteps that follow them after dark. I tried to tell Father, but he dismissed their fears as imagination. He doesn't see how the shadows move when no one's watching, how the corridors seem to stretch and twist when you're alone. I have to stop him before it's too late. Emma's hands shook as she turned the page, but the rest of the diary was blank. She looked up at the blackboard again, and her heart nearly stopped. Below the original message, new words had appeared. Check the blueprint room in the basement. What you seek lies beneath the foundation stones. The chalk suddenly shot off the ledge, flying across the room to shatter against the far wall. Emma stumbled backward, her elbow striking one of the antique desks. The impact sent a hollow echo through the room, but the echo came back wrong, distorted, as if it had bounced off walls in some vast, unseen space. That's when she noticed something else about the room. The shadows in the corners were moving, creeping along the walls like living things, and they were getting closer. Emma backed toward the door, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on the windows. The shadows continued their advance, and within their depths, she thought she could see shapes. Twisted, impossible shapes that hurt her eyes to look at. She reached the doorway just as the shadows converged on the spot where she had been standing. Through the darkness, she heard something that might have been laughter, a wet, gurgling sound that made her skin crawl. Emma slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The hallway lights flickered ominously, and in the brief moments of darkness, she could have sworn she saw a figure at the far end of the corridor, a woman in Victorian dress, pointing urgently toward the stairs. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway again, but this time they weren't following her movements. They were coming toward her, slow and deliberate, from both directions. Click-clack, click-clack. Emma ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time. She didn't stop until she reached the first floor, bursting into the security office where Mike Thompson, the night guard, sat watching the monitors. The blueprint room, she gasped, trying to catch her breath. We need to find the original blueprints. Mike looked up from his coffee, his weathered face creasing with concern. You went up to the third floor, didn't you? He sighed, reaching into his desk drawer. I was wondering how long it would take you. Here. He handed her a key that looked far older than the others on her ring. Basement level B3. But you might want to hear the rest of the story first. Emma sank into the chair across from his desk, her legs still shaking. What story? Mike turned one of the security monitors toward her. The screen showed the third-floor hallway, but something was wrong with the image. The proportions seemed to shift and change as she watched, and the shadows. The shadows weren't behaving like shadows should. Back in 1868, Mike began. When Jonathan Blackwood bought this land, he didn't just want to build a school. He was part of a secret society, the Order of the Geometric Dawn. They believed that certain architectural patterns could alter reality itself. The local Algonquin tried to warn him. This place, they said, was already a doorway of sorts. Their ancestors had built structures to keep it closed. But Blackwood, Mike shook his head. Blackwood thought he knew better. The resonance chamber, Emma whispered, remembering Elizabeth's diary. He was trying to open something. Mike nodded grimly. And he succeeded, sort of. But what came through wasn't what he expected. His daughter Elizabeth figured it out too late, but she managed one final act of defiance. She used her own life force to create a binding, becoming a kind of guardian. She's still here, trying to warn people away from what her father unleashed. But it's getting stronger, isn't it? Emma asked, watching the shadows writhe on the monitor. The binding is weakening. Mike's gaze shifted to the old grandfather clock in the corner of his office. Tonight's special, he said quietly. The moon's in the right position, and the stars. He trailed off, pulling an ancient-looking star chart from his desk drawer. Every 50 years, the cosmic alignment weakens the barriers. That's when people tend to disappear around here. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered her research. 1923, 3 students vanished. 1973, a teacher and 2 maintenance workers. She looked at Mike. And today is November 15th, 2023. Mike finished. Exactly 150 years since Elizabeth disappeared. He spread the star chart on his desk. Overlaid on the astronomical drawings were architectural diagrams of Blackwood Academy. The building's layout formed an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to shift and changed the longer Emma stared at it. "I didn't take this job by accident," Mike admitted. "My grandmother was one of the students who disappeared in 1923. She managed to leave a journal behind, hidden in the walls. I've spent 20 years working here, trying to understand what happened. And you?" He looked at Emma intently. "You didn't end up here by accident either." Emma thought about her failed marriage, her abandoned academic career, the strange compulsion that had drawn her to Blackwood Academy. "The divorce," she murmured. "James always said I was obsessed with my research into architectural symbolism. He called it a dead end." "Dead end?" Mike gave a bitter laugh. "More like too close to the truth. Your thesis about mystical architecture in educational institutions, it wasn't just theory, was it? You found patterns." Emma nodded slowly. "Similarities in design across different schools, all built in the same period. Geometric alignments that couldn't be coincidental. But every time I got close to publishing my findings, something would go wrong. Data would disappear. Sources would become unavailable." "The Order of the Geometric Dawn still exists," Mike said grimly. "They protect their secrets, but they don't understand what they're really protecting." He stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Come on. We need to get to that blueprint room before midnight." The descent to B3 felt like entering another world. The modern fluorescent lights gave way to old gas lamps that had been converted to electric, casting sickly yellow light over stone walls that grew progressively damper as they descended. The air became thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something organic and unpleasant. The blueprint room's door was made of heavy iron, its surface covered in geometric patterns that made Emma's eyes hurt if she looked at them too long. The key Mike had given her fit perfectly, but the door refused to budge until she traced one of the patterns with her finger. The metal was ice cold to the touch. Inside, the room was a maze of filing cabinets and rolled-up architectural drawings. But Emma's attention was immediately drawn to a large table in the center. Spread across it was a blueprint unlike any she'd ever seen. The paper was yellowed with age, the lines drawn in ink that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "That's not the original blueprint," Mike said, his voice tight with tension. "Look at the date." Emma leaned closer. "November 15th, 1873, the day Elizabeth disappeared. The drawing showed Blackwood Academy, but not as it was built. This was something else, something darker. The geometric patterns were different, twisted into configurations that seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose. She drew this, Emma realized. Elizabeth. She figured out what her father was really building. She traced the lines with a trembling finger. The school isn't just on a thin spot between worlds, it's a machine. The hallways, the rooms, they're all part of a geometric equation designed to... A sound from above cut her off, footsteps, but wrong somehow, as if they were walking on a ceiling instead of a floor. Dust drifted down from the stone overhead. "They're getting closer," Mike whispered. "The barriers are weakening." Emma's academic mind raced through what she knew. Sacred geometry, ley lines, astronomical alignments. She looked back at the blueprint, and suddenly the patterns seemed to click into place. "We're not just hearing echoes," she said. "We're hearing time itself breaking down. The footsteps, the voices, they're bleeding through from different periods, all happening at once." She pulled out her phone and opened her thesis notes. "Look at this," she said, showing Mike a diagram she created years ago. "I found this pattern repeated in dozens of schools built in the 1860s and 70s, but I never understood what it was for. It's not just about opening doors, it's about creating resonance. The whole building is like a tuning fork, designed to vibrate at exactly the right frequency to..." Another sound interrupted her, closer this time. Something wet and heavy dragged itself across the ceiling. The gas lamps flickered, and in the momentary darkness, Emma saw something move in the corners of the room. Shadows that weren't shadows, shapes that shouldn't exist. "We need to get back upstairs," Mike said urgently. "Whatever's coming through, it'll manifest on the 3rd floor first. That's where the geometric patterns are strongest." They ran for the stairs, but the journey up seemed to take much longer than the descent had. The steps felt wrong under their feet, as if they were climbing at an impossible angle. By the time they reached the 1st floor, Emma's legs were burning with exhaustion. The building had changed. The normally straight hallways now curved subtly, leading the eye toward impossible angles. Shadows writhed on the walls, and the air itself seemed to pulse with a sickly luminescence. "What time is it?" Emma gasped as they climbed toward the second floor. Mike checked his watch and swore. 11:55. "We have 5 minutes until the alignment peaks." As they reached the third floor, the wrongness intensified. The hallway stretched before them, impossibly long, the doors multiplying and shifting like reflections in a broken mirror. The fluorescent lights flickered madly, and in the strobing darkness, Emma caught glimpses of other times. Students in Victorian dress hurrying to class, maintenance workers from the 1970s checking the walls, all of them moving like ghosts through the present moment. "Elizabeth," Emma called out, her voice echoing strangely. "We know what your father did. We're here to help." The temperature plummeted. Frost crackled across the windows, forming patterns that matched the geometric designs hidden in the building's architecture. And then she appeared, Elizabeth Blackwood, her form wavering like a reflection in troubled water. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, something moved in the shadows. Something vast and ancient and hungry. Emma could see pieces of it now. Angles that shouldn't exist, geometries that hurt her mind to look at, all writhing together in a massive darkness that seemed to devour light itself. The resonance, Elizabeth's voice echoed in Emma's mind. "You have to disrupt the pattern before midnight. My father's equations. They're still active, still pulling it through." Emma pulled out the blueprint from the basement, spreading it on the floor. The geometric patterns seemed to move on the page, pulsing in time with the building's unnatural vibrations. She compared them to her thesis notes, to the star charts Mike had shown her. Here, she pointed to a series of intersecting lines. "These aren't just hallways, they're like violin strings, tuned to specific frequencies. If we can change the geometry, break the patterns—" "The chalk," Mike said suddenly, pulling a piece from his pocket. "From your research, sacred geometry needs perfect forms. What if we disrupt the patterns?" Emma understood immediately. She began drawing on the walls and floor, using the mathematical principles she'd studied to create counterpatterns. Each line she drew seemed to stabilize the reality around it, pushing back against the wrongness that was trying to break through. The thing in the shadows roared, a sound that existed more in their minds than in the air. It surged forward, tentacles of darkness reaching for them. But Elizabeth moved to stand between them and the entity, her form becoming more solid. "The chalk," she said, her voice clearer now. "It's the same chalk from my classroom, blessed by the Algonquin elders. Use it." Emma drew faster, her academic knowledge combining with an instinctive understanding of what needed to be done. Mike took another piece of chalk and started at the other end of the hallway, drawing protective circles and counter patterns. The building began to shake. Through the windows, Emma could see the stars wheeling overhead, aligning into the fatal pattern that would complete Jonathan Blackwood's century-and-a-half-old equation. They had less than a minute. The thing in the shadows reached for her, its touch burning cold. But as it crossed one of her chalk lines, it recoiled. The geometric patterns were working, forcing reality back into its proper shape. "The final line," Elizabeth shouted. "Complete the circle." Emma looked at her notes one last time, understanding flooding through her. The building's design wasn't just a door, it was a circuit designed to channel energy in a specific pattern. Break the circuit, and the whole thing would collapse. She drew the final line just as the clock struck midnight. For a moment, everything stopped. The air itself seemed to freeze. Then, with a sound like reality tearing, the darkness imploded. The impossible geometries snapped back into normal shapes, the extra doors vanished, and the temperature began to rise. Elizabeth stood before them, more solid than she'd ever appeared. "You did it," she said, smiling. "The patterns are broken. The door is closed." She began to fade, but it will try again. In 50 years, when the stars align, someone will need to be ready. "We'll make sure they are," Emma promised. "Your father's research, the Order's secrets, we'll preserve them, but not to open doors. To keep them closed." Elizabeth nodded, her form almost gone now. "The echoes will remain," she whispered. "But now they're guardians, not gates. Listen to them. They'll warn you when the geometry starts to shift again. And then she was gone, leaving Emma and Mike alone in a hallway that finally felt like just a hallway. In the months that followed, Emma didn't quit her job at Blackwood Academy. Instead, she began documenting everything: the patterns, the prophecies, the protections they'd put in place. She and Mike created a hidden archive, preparing for the next generation who would have to defend against the darkness. Students still tell ghost stories about the third floor, but they're different now. They talk about the two guardians who walk the halls at night, the Victorian teacher who gave her life to protect the school, and the historian who learned to see the patterns in the echoes. The Order of the Geometric Dawn still exists, but they've lost their power over Blackwood Academy. The building's sacred geometry now serves a different purpose, not to open doors, but to keep them firmly closed. Emma still hears the echoes sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the moon is dark, but she doesn't fear them anymore. They're not harbingers of something trying to break through. They're reminders of the night she helped reset the balance, when she learned that some knowledge isn't meant to open doors, but to seal them forever. And if you walk the third-floor hallway late at night, you might hear footsteps following yours. Don't be afraid. They're not trying to harm you. They're making sure you're safe, keeping watch over the thin places where reality wears thin. Just remember, if you see chalk marks on the walls and floor, leave them be. They're not just drawings, they're equations that keep our world safe from what waits beyond the threshold. Because in the end, the echoes in the hallway aren't just sounds. They're the heartbeat of the barrier between our world and the hungry dark that waits beyond. The fluorescent lights in Ward 23 had always flickered, casting strange shadows across the dingy hospital corridors. Rachel Matthews had worked the night shift long enough to know that every building had its quirks, its own personality of sorts. But there was something different about Ward 23, something that made even the most hardened nurses request transfers after a few months. Rachel wasn't like them. She'd stuck it out for 5 years now, telling herself it was just a job, just another paycheck. The truth? She couldn't leave. Not because she loved it, God no, but because something about this place had its hooks in her, deep under her skin, pulling her back night after night like an addiction she couldn't shake. The ward housed the long-term patients, the ones other hospitals had given up on, the ones whose families had stopped visiting months or years ago. They were the forgotten ones, existing in a limbo between life and death, kept alive by machines and medications and the tired hands of nurses like Rachel. Her colleagues often wondered why she chose to stay. Some whispered that she must have a martyr complex. Others suggested she was simply too stubborn to quit. The truth was more complicated. Rachel had tried leaving once, about 2 years ago. She'd even lined up a position at a private clinic across town. Better hours, better pay, living patients who could actually talk back. But the night before she was supposed to start her new job, she'd woken in a cold sweat, her heart racing, her mind filled with images of Ward 23's empty corridors. She called in sick the next day, and the day after that, until eventually, the clinic filled the position with someone else. She told herself it was just anxiety about change, but deep down, she knew better. Ward 23 wouldn't let her go. That night, that awful, changing night, started like any other. Rachel arrived for her shift at 11 p.m., coffee in hand, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. The handover from the day shift was routine. Mrs. Johnson in room 4 needed her dressing changed. Mr. Peters in room 7 was refusing his meds again. And the John Doe in room 13, well, he was the same as always. Unresponsive, unknown, unclaimed. You should see about transferring him. Jenny, the day nurse, had suggested, not for the first time. We need the bed. Rachel had nodded, though they both knew it wouldn't happen. John Doe had been there longer than she had, his presence as much a part of Ward 23 as the flickering lights and the smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying scent of decay. He's been here, 6 years now? Jenny continued, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty corridor. No ID, no family, no changes in condition. It's not right, keeping him like this. The hospital board won't approve a transfer, Rachel replied mechanically, the same response she always gave. Not without next of kin consent. Jenny shook her head, gathering her belongings. Well, your shift, your problem now. Try to get some rest between rounds. You're looking a bit pale. Rachel watched her colleague leave, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into the ambient hum of medical equipment. Pale, Jenny had said. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her own reflection clearly. The mirrors in Ward 23 always seemed clouded, as if they'd absorbed too many reflections of death over the years. The night progressed as it always did. Rachel made her rounds, checking vitals, administering medications, recording everything in neat, precise handwriting. The quiet was broken only by the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional moan from a patient lost in dreams or nightmares. Mrs. Johnson was awake when Rachel entered room 4, her roomy eyes tracking the nurse's movements with unusual clarity. "It's getting closer," she whispered as Rachel changed her dressing. "Can't you feel it?" "What's getting closer, Mrs. Johnson?" Rachel asked, more out of habit than curiosity. The elderly woman often spoke in riddles, especially during the night shift. "The hunger," Mrs. Johnson replied, her thin fingers clutching at Rachel's wrist with surprising strength. "It lives in the walls, feeds on the dying, and now it's found someone new to feed it." Rachel gently extracted her wrist, forcing a reassuring smile. "Try to get some sleep, Mrs. Johnson. The night nurse will be in to check on you later." As she left the room, Rachel rubbed her wrist where Mrs. Johnson had grabbed her, for tiny crescents marked her skin where the old woman's nails had dug in. They looked almost like teeth marks in the dim light. It was during her 3 a.m. round that she first noticed something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper, and the sounds, the familiar symphony of medical equipment, felt somehow off-key. She paused outside room 13, her hand hovering over the door handle. Something wasn't right. The heart monitor's steady beeping had changed its rhythm, become more intentional, like Morse code, like it was trying to tell her something. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered to herself, pushing the door open. The room was dark, save for the green glow of the monitors. John Doe lay there as he always did, pale and still, his features sharp in the dim light. But something about him seemed different tonight, more present, more aware. Rachel approached the bed, her shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. She reached for his wrist to check his pulse, a routine she'd performed thousands of times before. His skin was cold, colder than usual, and just as her fingers found his pulse point, his other hand shot up and grabbed her arm. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. His eyes were open now, staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. They weren't the vacant eyes of a coma patient. They were ancient, knowing, hungry. "Rachel Matthews," he said, his voice like gravel, like he'd been saving these words for years. "I've been waiting for you." She should have run, should have called for help, but she didn't. Instead, she stood there, transfixed, as he continued to speak. "5 years you've worked here. 5 years you've cared for these lost souls. But that's not why you stay, is it?" His grip tightened on her arm. "You stay because you're just like them. Lost. Forgotten. Hungry for something you can't name." I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. But the lie felt hollow even to her own ears. The truth was, she did know. She'd felt it growing inside her over the years, a void that seemed to deepen with each passing shift. He smiled then, a terrible thing that split his face like a wound. "Oh, but you do. You feel it every night, don't you? The emptiness, the longing, the desire to matter, to be more than just another tired nurse in a forgotten ward." His words slithered into her mind like smoke, finding purchase in the darkest corners of her thoughts. "Your mother died here, didn't she?" he continued, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "In this very ward. That's why you came back. That's why you stay." Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't told anyone about that, about how she'd watched her mother waste away in room 9, about how the machines had kept beeping long after any hope of recovery had faded, about how, in those final days, she'd caught herself wishing it would just end. "How did you?" "I know everything that happens in Ward 23, he interrupted. "Every death, every tear, every whispered prayer for release. And I know you, Rachel Matthews. I know the thoughts you hide even from yourself. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Let me go, she whispered, her voice trembling. I can help you, he said. I can show you how to fill that emptiness. All you have to do is help me first. And then he told her what he wanted, what he needed. The words should have horrified her, should have made her run screaming from the room. But they didn't, because deep down, in that dark place she never acknowledged, they made a terrible kind of sense. Just one, he whispered. Just one to start. There are so many here already close to death. No one would notice. No one would care. Like Mrs. Johnson, she's been asking for release for months now. You've heard her prayers, haven't you? Late at night, when she thinks no one's listening, Rachel felt something inside her crack, like thin ice giving way beneath her feet. Images flashed through her mind. Mrs. Johnson's pleading eyes, the morphine pump's steady drip, the way the old woman's breath rattled in her chest like a broken machine. I can't, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You already have, he replied, releasing her arm. Every time you've given just a little too much morphine. Every time you've been a little too slow to respond to an alarm. Every time you've wished, just for a moment, that one of them would finally let go. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. Because he was right. God help her. He was right. How many times had she stood by a patient's bed, finger hovering over the morphine pump's controls, thinking about how easy it would be to just help things along? It's not murder, he said, as if reading her thoughts. It's mercy, release, freedom, for them and for you. Rachel's hands were shaking now, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The room seemed to spin around her, the shadows on the walls writhing like living things. In the dim light, John Doe's eyes gleamed with an unholy hunger. Why me? She managed to ask. His smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. Because you're special, Rachel. Because you understand the truth about places like Ward 23. They're not meant to heal. They're meant to feed. The pain, the suffering, the slow decay of hope. It all has to go somewhere. Has to feed something. He gestured at the walls around them, and for a moment, Rachel thought she saw something moving within them. Dark shapes writhing beneath the peeling paint, hungry mouths opening and closing in endless silence. These walls have absorbed so much death, he continued. So much despair. But they need more. They always need more. And you, Rachel, you can help feed them. Help maintain the balance. After all, isn't that what nurses do? Maintain balance? That night, Rachel Matthews made a choice. Or maybe the choice had been made long ago, and she was just finally admitting it to herself. She walked to room 4, where Mrs. Johnson lay sleeping, her breathing already shallow, her life already slipping away. It's okay, Rachel whispered, reaching for the morphine pump. I'm helping you. I'm helping both of us. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting the dosage just enough. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. Just a little more than necessary, just enough to ease Mrs. Johnson's passage from this world to the next. As she worked, she felt something stirring in the air around her. A presence, a weight, an anticipation. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to lean forward like eager spectators at a show. Mrs. Johnson's eyes fluttered open one last time, fixing on Rachel with a clarity that hadn't been there for months. I knew it would be you, she whispered. I knew you could hear them too. Then her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, and the monitor's steady beeping gradually faded into a single, continuous tone. Rachel stood there, watching, feeling something fundamental shift inside her as Mrs. Johnson's life slipped away. The shadows moved then, properly moved, sliding across the walls like liquid darkness. They converged on Mrs. Johnson's body, and for a moment, just a moment, Rachel thought she saw something being drawn out of the old woman, something bright and vital that the shadows eagerly devoured. When she returned to room 13, John Doe was sitting up in his bed, looking stronger, more alive. His smile was different now, knowing, satisfied. Good girl, he said. How did it feel? And the worst part? The part that would haunt Rachel for years to come. It had felt right. It had felt good. Like scratching an itch she hadn't known was there. Like filling a void she hadn't realized was empty. That was just the beginning. Over the next few months, more patients in Ward 23 passed away peacefully in their sleep. Always the ones who were already close to death. Always in ways that seemed natural. And with each death, John Doe grew stronger, more vibrant, while Rachel changed too. The emptiness inside her began to fill with something else, something dark and hungry. She found herself looking forward to her shifts, to the quiet moments when she could help another soul find peace. She told herself she was being merciful, that she was ending suffering. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't doing it for them. She was doing it for him, for herself, for the hungry shadows that lived in the walls. Her appearance began to change, though she hardly noticed at first. Her skin grew paler, her eyes darker, deeper, as if they were absorbing the shadows around her. The other nurses whispered about her in break rooms and corridors, but no one dared confront her directly. After all, Ward 23 had always been different, and Rachel was just another of its quirks now. The patients seemed to sense the change in her too. The more lucid ones would watch her with a mixture of fear and longing as she moved through her rounds. Some would beg her to stay away, while others would reach for her with trembling hands, pleading for the release they knew she could provide. One night, after helping another patient find peace, Rachel returned to room 13 to find John Doe standing by the window, his hospital gown replaced by a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. "It's time," he said, turning to face her. "You've done well, Rachel. Better than I could have hoped." "Time for what?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Time for you to take my place," he said, his smile now more terrible than ever. "Someone needs to tend to Ward 23, to help the lost souls move on. Someone needs to feed the hunger that lives in these walls. And you, my dear Rachel, have proven yourself more than capable." And Rachel understood then, with perfect clarity, what she had become, what she had always been meant to be. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see blood, but they were clean. They were always clean. That was the beauty of it, wasn't it? "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the enormity of what was happening. "Now." His laugh was like breaking glass. "Now you become what you were always meant to be. The guardian of Ward 23. The keeper of its secrets. The one who decides when it's time for peace." He stepped closer, his form seeming to blur at the edges, becoming one with the shadows that danced on the walls. "The hunger never ends, Rachel. It must be fed. But you already know that, don't you? You felt it growing inside you, replacing everything else, becoming everything else." He reached out, his hand now more shadow than flesh, and touched her cheek. His touch was cold, so cold it burned, and Rachel felt something dark and ancient flow from him into her, filling every empty space inside her with shadows and hunger and purpose. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, they found John Doe's bed empty. No one could explain where he had gone, how a coma patient had simply vanished. But Rachel knew, just like she knew that she would never leave Ward 23 now. Not really. Even when her shift ended, even when she went home, part of her would always remain here, in these dim corridors, waiting for the next lost soul who needed her special kind of care. The fluorescent lights still flicker in Ward 23, casting strange shadows across the dingy hospital corridors. And if you find yourself there late at night, you might see Rachel Matthews making her rounds, her steps quiet, her smile gentle, her eyes holding a darkness that seems to swallow the light. They say she's the best nurse they've ever had. So dedicated, so caring. But if you look closely, you might notice how the patients in her care seem to find peace more quickly than others. How the shadows in the corners of rooms seem deeper when she passes by. How her touch, though gentle, carries a chill that seeps into your bones. Because Rachel Matthews finally found her calling in Ward 23. She found her purpose in those quiet, dark hours between midnight and dawn, helping lost souls move on, feeding the hunger that lives in the walls. And if sometimes, in the deepest part of night, you hear something that sounds like weeping coming from those shadowy corridors, well, That's just Ward 23 being Ward 23. After all, every building has its quirks, its own personality, its own appetite, and Ward 23's appetite is always, always growing. There are things that children understand instinctively, truths that adults have forgotten how to see. Margaret Chin had always known this. It was part of why she became a child psychologist. But it wasn't until the Anderson case that she truly understood just how deep that wisdom went and how terrible the price of remembering could be. It started with a referral from Cedar Grove Elementary. 10-year-old Alice Anderson hadn't slept in her own room for 3 weeks. Her grades were slipping, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she jumped at every shadow. The school counselor had tried everything in their toolkit, but Alice wouldn't talk about what was frightening her. She just keeps saying her nightlight is broken. The counselor told Margaret over the phone, but here's the thing. Her parents have replaced it 4 times now. Each one burns out within hours of being plugged in. Margaret's office was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house, decorated to put young patients at ease. Soft colors, comfortable furniture, and carefully chosen toys that doubled as diagnostic tools. But when Alice walked in, she wouldn't touch any of them. She stood in the doorway, scanning the corners of the room with the hypervigilance Margaret usually associated with trauma victims. "It's okay," Margaret said softly. "You can sit wherever you feel safest." Alice chose the chair closest to the door, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. She was a slight girl with auburn hair pulled back in a neat braid, wearing a NASA t-shirt that seemed to swallow her thin frame. "Your teachers say you're having trouble sleeping," Margaret began gently. "Would you like to tell me about that?" Alice's eyes darted to the window, then back to the corners. "You won't believe me," she whispered. "Nobody does. They just keep buying new nightlights. But that's not the problem. The problem is what makes them burn out." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "What do you think makes them burn out, Alice?" "Not think," Alice corrected with the precise irritation of a gifted child. "No, I know what makes them burn out, because I've seen it. It feeds on the light." A chill ran down Margaret's spine, though she kept her expression neutral. "Can you tell me more about what you've seen?" Alice pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller. "It started after we moved into the new house. Mom said the nightlight would help me adjust, but..." She swallowed hard. "The first night, I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. The nightlight was flickering, but not like normal flickering. It was like something was drinking the light, pulling it away from the bulb, and in the darkness between flickers, I saw it." "What did you see, Alice?" "A shadow, but wrong. Shadows are supposed to be flat, right? This one had depth. It was like looking into a hole, but the hole was shaped like a person, and it was hungry." Alice's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "It's always hungry." Margaret made a note on her pad, trying to ignore the way the afternoon sunlight seemed to dim slightly as Alice spoke. "Has it tried to hurt you?" Alice shook her head. "Not yet, but it gets bigger every night. At first, it was just in the corner by my dresser. Now it takes up the whole wall. And..." She hesitated, glancing at the door. "Last night, I saw it in the hallway outside my room. It's getting stronger. Because of the light it drinks?" "No." Alice's voice was firm. "The light doesn't make it stronger. The light shows where it is. That's why it breaks the night lights. It doesn't want me to see it coming. But I can feel it getting stronger because..." She stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "Because what, Alice?" "Because my little brother started seeing it too. And now Mom's nightlight is flickering." The sun chose that moment to slip behind a cloud, plunging the office into sudden shadow. Alice gasped, her hands tightening on her backpack straps. Margaret moved to turn on her desk lamp, but when she pressed the switch, nothing happened. "The bulb must be burned out," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. But when she looked back at Alice, the girl's face was a mask of terror. "It's here," Alice whispered. "It followed me." Margaret tried to maintain her professional composure, but something about Alice's words resonated with a long-buried memory. When she was a child, hadn't she too been afraid of something that lived in the darkness? Something that made lights die? The shadows in the office corners seemed deeper than they should be, more defined. Alice was watching them with the focused attention of prey, tracking a predator. "Tell me about your brother," Margaret said, trying to draw the girl's attention back. "When did he start seeing it?" 3 days ago," Alice whispered, still watching the corners. "Tommy's only 6. He shouldn't have to see it. I tried to let him sleep in my room, but—" She swallowed hard. "It likes that. When we're scared together, it gets stronger." Margaret made another note, but her pen barely marked the paper. The ink seemed to fade even as she wrote, as if the darkness was drinking it too. "And your parents? What do they say about all this?" "They don't believe us. Dad says old houses make weird shadows, and Mom—" Alice's voice cracked. "Mom keeps saying she's just tired. That's why she sees things moving in the mirrors. But I heard them fighting last night. Dad's night light burned out too." A memory surfaced in Margaret's mind. Her grandmother's voice, speaking in hurried Mandarin about hungry ghosts and the dangers of darkness. She called them light eaters. As a psychology student, Margaret had dismissed those stories as superstition. Now, watching the shadows creep across her office floor, she wasn't so sure. "Alice," she said carefully, "in your new house, are there any rooms where the shadows don't gather? Any place that feels safe?" The girl thought for a moment. "The kitchen, sometimes. It has lots of windows, and Mom hung these little crystals that make rainbows when the sun hits them. The shadow thing doesn't like rainbows, but—" She hugged her knees tighter. "The sun's getting weaker too. The rainbows aren't as bright as they used to be." Margaret glanced at her office window. The cloud that had covered the sun should have passed by now, but the sky remained dark. When she checked her phone for the time, the screen seemed dimmer than usual. "Does it?" Margaret hesitated, knowing she was crossing a line between professional distance and personal involvement. "Does it make a sound?" Alice's eyes widened. "You've heard it too, haven't you? That kind of hungry whisper? Like something drinking through a straw, but the straw is made of darkness." Before Margaret could respond, her desk lamp suddenly flickered to life. But the light it cast was wrong, tinted with colors that had no place in the visible spectrum. In that strange illumination, the shadows on the walls seemed to pulse like living things. "Don't look at them directly," Alice said, her voice eerily calm. "That's how it marks you. Once it knows you can see it, it starts following you too." But Margaret was already looking. In the corner of her office, where the ceiling met the walls, she saw something that defied explanation. The shadows there had depth, like a window into an endless void. And in that void, something moved, a shape that suggested a human form, but was horribly, fundamentally wrong. The lamp died with a soft pop, plunging the room back into twilight. In the sudden darkness, Margaret heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something drinking the light itself. "We need to go," Alice said, standing up. "It's stronger here than at my house. Your office is older. It's had more time to feed." "Alice, wait," Margaret called, but the girl was already moving toward the door. "Where are you going?" "To the library," Alice replied without turning around. "That's where I found it. The book that explains what they are. I didn't understand all of it, but—" She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "You're marked now too, Dr. Chun. You need to know what we're dealing with." The shadows in the corners seemed to lean forward, as if listening. Margaret grabbed her coat and bag, professional boundaries forgotten in the face of something that traced back to her grandmother's darkest warnings. As they left the office, every light in the hallway flickered and died, one by one, like stars being devoured by an advancing darkness. The public library was a massive Gothic revival building that had served the city since 1893. As Margaret followed Alice up the worn stone steps, she noticed how the afternoon shadows seemed to pool unnaturally around the building's base, like dark water gathering before a flood. "The book's in the restricted section," Alice said, leading the way with the confidence of a regular visitor. "Mrs. Blackwood, the head librarian, lets me go there because I help shelve books after school. Or at least, I used to, before." She didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret noticed how the girls' steps quickened as they passed through the towering main doors. Inside, the library's grand reading room should have been filled with warm autumn light streaming through its stained glass windows. Instead, the vast space felt dimmer than it should, the shadows between the towering bookshelves deeper and more absolute. Alice, elderly woman with silver hair, looked up from the circulation desk. I was worried when you stopped coming to help. Are you feeling better? Her smile faded as she noticed the girl's exhausted face. Then she saw Margaret and straightened, professional concern replacing grand motherly warmth. I'm Helen Blackwood. Are you Alice's? Dr. Chun. Margaret introduced herself. I'm a child psychologist. Alice was just telling me about a book she found here. Mrs. Blackwood's expression changed subtly. The Lundberg text, she said, not a question. I wondered if that's what started all this. She glanced at the deepening shadows, then lowered her voice. Come with me, both of you. Quickly, she led them through a maze of bookshelves to a heavy oak door marked Special Collections. Inside, the room smelled of old leather and preservation chemicals. Unlike the main library, this space was brightly lit by modern LED fixtures that created overlapping pools of light, leaving no room for shadows. I should have been more careful about what I let you access, Mrs. Blackwood said to Alice as she unlocked a glass-fronted cabinet. Some books. They're restricted for a reason. She pulled out a large volume bound in faded black leather. The cover bore no title, only a complex geometric pattern that seemed to shift slightly when viewed directly. Dr. Victor Lundberg's research into photophagic entities, she explained, published in 1891, just before he disappeared. Most copies were destroyed, but a few survived. Margaret reached for the book, but Mrs. Blackwood held it back. Before I show you this, you need to understand something. Knowledge has power, but it also has consequences. Once you learn what these things really are, you can't unlearn it. And they... She glanced at the door, where shadows were already gathering despite the bright lights. They know when you know about them. I already see them, Alice said quietly. We both do now. Please, we need to know how to stop them. Mrs. Blackwood sighed and opened the book. The pages were covered in dense text and disturbing illustrations, creatures of shadow drawn in faded ink, geometric diagrams that hurt the eyes, and photographs that seemed impossibly dark despite the paper they were printed on. Lundberg called them umberphages, she explained, turning pages carefully. Light eaters. He believed they weren't supernatural creatures at all, but parasites from another dimension where light behaves differently. They break through in places where reality is thin. Old buildings, spaces with history. At first, they can only manifest in true darkness, but as they feed, they get stronger, Alice finished. That's why they break the nightlights. They're not just eating the light, they're practicing, learning how to exist in our world. Margaret studied a diagram that showed the progression. A simple shadow becoming something with depth, then form, then hunger. My grandmother used to talk about hungry ghosts, she said. But these aren't ghosts, are they? No, Mrs. Blackwood replied. Ghosts are echoes of what was. These are harbingers of what's coming. Look at this. She turned to a page near the end of the book. The text there was rushed, the handwriting increasingly frantic. This is Lundberg's final entry. He tracked an umberphage infestation in Stockholm. At first, it was just burned-out lights and strange shadows. But as the creatures fed, they grew bold. They started taking people. Taking them where? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. To their dimension, Alice said, pointing to an illustration, where everything is shadow and the light is dying. That's what I dream about now. A place where the darkness goes on forever, and the only light comes from... She stopped, shuddering. From what, Alice? From the people they took. They keep them there, burning like stars until they go out. The lights in the special collections room flickered ominously. Mrs. Blackwood immediately pulled a set of emergency candles from a drawer. They're blessed, she explained, lighting them. Old trick I learned from a Romanian priest. They won't burn out like electric lights. Margaret watched the candlelight push back the encroaching shadows. You've dealt with these things before, haven't you? The librarian's face grew solemn. 30 years ago, we lost 3 children before we figured out how to fight them. I thought. She glanced at the shadows that were now writhing at the edges of the candlelight. I thought we'd sealed all the thin places in the city, but something's changed. They're breaking through again, The Anderson house, Margaret realized. It must be a thin place. Not originally, Alice said, still studying Lundberg's book. But look at this part about dimensional resonance. When enough people believe in darkness, when they feed it with their fear. She pointed to a complex equation. They can make new thin places. A cold draft swept through the room despite the closed windows. The candle flames danced wildly, and in their shifting light, Margaret saw something that made her blood freeze. The shadows cast by the bookshelves weren't matching the objects casting them anymore. They were stretching, reaching, taking on impossible shapes. "They're here," Alice whispered. "More than one now." Mrs. Blackwood moved quickly, pulling more books from the restricted section. Lundberg wasn't the only one who studied them. "Here." She handed Margaret a slim volume with Sanskrit text. The ancient Indians knew about them. They called them light devourers and developed ways to fight them. "How?" Margaret asked, leafing through the fragile pages. "Prisms," Alice said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "That's why they hate the rainbows in our kitchen. Look." She pointed to a diagram in Lundberg's book. "They can only exist in pure darkness or pure light. If you split the light into its spectrum, it disrupts their ability to feed," Mrs. Blackwood finished. "But it has to be natural light, refracted properly. Artificial spectrum generation won't work." The shadows in the corners had begun to take on that horrible depth Alice had described. Margaret could see them now. Shapes that suggested human form but were wrong in fundamental ways, like three-dimensional shadows cast by four-dimensional objects. "We need to get back to your house," Margaret told Alice. "Your family is already marked," Mrs. Blackwood interrupted grimly. "But there might still be time. The winter solstice is coming, the longest night of the year. That's when they're strongest, when they can fully cross over. If they take your family then—" She didn't need to finish. The illustration in Lundberg's book showed what happened to those taken by the umbrophages. Bodies transformed into living light sources, burning eternally in a dimension of absolute darkness. 3 days, Alice said, checking her phone's calendar. "We have 3 days until the solstice." The candles flickered again, and this time one went out despite its blessing. In the momentary darkness, Margaret heard that wet, sucking sound, closer now and multiplied, as if several creatures were feeding at once. "Take these," Mrs. Blackwood said, pressing a bag into Margaret's hands. It contained prisms of various sizes and shapes, along with what looked like ancient scrolls. Instructions for the binding ritual. It won't kill them. They can't be killed in our dimension. But it will seal the thin places they're using to break through. "Why are you giving these to me?" Margaret asked. "Surely you're more experienced." "Because I'm already too late." Mrs. Blackwood's voice was calm, even as the shadows began to circle her. "I've been fighting them too long. They've been feeding on my light for years, waiting for me to weaken. But you—" She looked at Margaret intently. "You have your grandmother's gift, the ability to see between worlds. And Alice has something even rarer. She understands them. Together, you might have a chance." Another candle went out. In the diminishing light, Margaret saw tears running down Alice's face. The girl could see what was happening to Mrs. Blackwood. How the shadows were drawing closer. How her very essence seemed to be growing dimmer. "Run," the librarian commanded. "I'll hold them here as long as I can. Get to the house. Perform the ritual. Save that family." "Helen," Margaret started, but Mrs. Blackwood cut her off. "Go. They're stronger together. If they take all of you at once, during the solstice—" She pulled out one last item, a small crystal pendant. "My mother's. It's a natural prism. Use it to find the thin places. Now go." The last candle sputtered as Margaret grabbed Alice's hand and ran. Behind them, they heard Mrs. Blackwood begin to chant in a language that predated Latin, her voice strong despite the darkness that was consuming her. They burst out of the library into twilight that seemed unnaturally deep for the time of day. The sun was still visible, but its light seemed weak, as if something was drinking it straight from the sky. "We need to get to my house," Alice said, her voice shaking. "Tommy, he's afraid of the dark. He'll have all the lights on, trying to keep them away, but that'll just make them stronger." Margaret looked at the crystal pendant, then at the fading sun. They had 3 days until the solstice, when the barrier between dimensions would be thinnest. 3 days to save the Anderson family, and perhaps Mrs. Blackwood too, if she still lived. The shadows were gathering around them, moving against the wind like liquid darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, something was watching them with hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with light. The Anderson house stood at the end of Maple Street, a Victorian mansion that had been divided into apartments decades ago. In the deepening twilight, its windows blazed with artificial light, every bulb in every room burning against the darkness. But even from the street, Margaret could see how the lights seemed dimmer than they should be, as if something was drinking their radiance. "Mom keeps buying new bulbs," Alice said as they hurried up the walk. "But they burn out so fast now, and the ones that don't burn out just get weaker and weaker." Through the crystal pendant, Margaret saw what the human eye couldn't perceive. Threads of darkness wrapping around the house like hungry vines, pulsing with negative light. The entire building had become a thin place, reality wearing down under the constant assault of the umbrophages. They found Tommy in the kitchen, surrounded by a fortress of flashlights. The 6-year-old's face was pale with exhaustion, his eyes huge in the artificial glare. "They're in the walls now," he whispered as they entered. "I can hear them drinking." Margaret could hear it too, that horrible sucking sound, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The kitchen's fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, she caught glimpses of moving shadows that had nothing to do with the objects casting them. "Where are your parents?" she asked, pulling out the prisms from Mrs. Blackwood's bag. "Dad's at work," Alice answered, helping her brother up. "Mom's upstairs. She hasn't come down since this morning. She says the mirrors are wrong." Margaret remembered what Alice had said about her mother seeing things moving in mirrors. According to Lundberg's research, reflective surfaces were often the first places where umbrophages became visible in our dimension. They used mirrors like windows, pressing against the thin barrier between their world and ours. "We need to get to her," Margaret said. "The solstice is coming, and they're getting stronger. If we don't perform the binding ritual before sunset..." She didn't need to finish. They all knew what was at stake. The stairs creaked as they climbed, each step taking them deeper into darkness despite the multiple lamps illuminating the stairwell. The crystal pendant grew cold against Margaret's chest, vibrating with proximity to the thin places. They found Mrs. Anderson in the master bedroom, huddled in a corner with all the mirrors covered by sheets. She looked up as they entered, her face gaunt with fear. "The lights," she whispered. "They're not working anymore. Nothing works anymore." Margaret began setting up the prisms according to the ritual diagrams, arranging them in a complex pattern that would capture and split any remaining light. "Mrs. Anderson," she said gently, "I know what you've been seeing. They're called umbrophages, creatures that feed on light. But we can stop them." "I thought I was going crazy," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice breaking. "James, my husband, he doesn't see them. He says it's just stress, but..." She gestured to the covered mirrors. "They're getting bolder. This morning, one of them reached through the bathroom mirror. I saw its hand, like a shadow given depth, reaching for me. A bulb burst somewhere downstairs, followed by another and another. The darkness was rising, floor by floor, drinking every source of light in its path. "Quick," Margaret said, pulling out the scrolls. "We need to form a circle. The ritual requires 4 points north, south, east, west. Each point needs both a witness and a light source." "But the lights don't work," Tommy said, clutching his sister's hand. "Not artificial light," Margaret explained, removing the sheets from the mirrors. "We need natural light, refracted and multiplied." "Alice, you were right about the rainbows. They're not just pretty, they're weapons." She positioned the family members at 3 points of the compass, placing prisms before each of them. At the 4th point, she set up Mrs. Blackwood's crystal pendant. The sun was setting, its last rays weak against the advancing darkness, but when they hit the prisms, something remarkable happened. The light split and refracted, creating not just rainbows but complex patterns of spectral illumination that seemed to cut through the dimensional barriers. The shadows retreated from these patterns, writhing as if in pain. Margaret began to read from the ancient scrolls, her grandmother's teachings helping her pronounce the Sanskrit words correctly. With each phrase, the prism's light grew stronger, more focused. The shadows tried to fight back, manifesting fully now. Human-shaped voids that moved with horrible grace through the darkness between the light patterns. One of them reached for Tommy, but Alice threw herself in front of her brother, holding up her prism. The creature recoiled as the refracted light touched it, its form dispersing like smoke in strong wind. The chant built to a crescendo as the sun touched the horizon. This was the moment of greatest danger, twilight, when the barriers between dimensions were naturally thinner. The umbrophages pressed closer, their hunger a palpable force in the room. That's when Margaret saw it, in the largest mirror, a familiar face. Mrs. Blackwood, her form glowing with internal light. She hadn't been taken to the shadow dimension. She transformed herself into pure light, using her own essence to power one final spell. Now, the librarian's voice echoed from the mirror. Complete the binding. Margaret spoke the final words of the ritual just as the sun vanished. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the prisms flared with impossible brightness, their refracted light forming a geometric cage of pure spectrum. The umbrophages screamed, a sound like light being torn apart, as they were forced back through the thin places. Reality itself seemed to shudder and reform. The darkness retreated, leaving behind normal shadows that behaved as shadows should. The mirrors showed only ordinary reflections, and the constant sound of feeding that had haunted the house fell silent. In the aftermath, Margaret helped the Anderson family cleanse their home. They hung prisms in every window, creating permanent barriers against dimensional intrusion. The thin places would never fully heal, but they could be defended. Mrs. Blackwood's sacrifice wasn't forgotten. The crystal pendant, now hanging in the library's special collections room, sometimes catches the light in impossible ways, creating rainbows that move against the sun's direction. And on very quiet days, visitors swear they can hear her voice in the whisper of turning pages, still standing guard against the darkness. Alice went back to shelving books at the library, but now she had a special pass for the restricted section. She and Margaret began documenting their own research into the umbrophages, adding to Lundberg's work. They mapped the city's thin places, set up early warning systems, and trained others to recognize the signs of dimensional weakening. Tommy sleeps with a prism on his windowsill now instead of a night light. He says it's better. The rainbows it makes chase away not just the shadow creatures, but ordinary nightmares too. And if sometimes, in old buildings or quiet places, they hear that wet, sucking sound or see shadows that seem deeper than they should be, they don't panic. They know what to do now, because light may feed the darkness, but split light, light revealed in all its complex, spectral glory, reminds the universe that shadows are just absence, not entropy. The umbrophages still exist, still hunger, still wait in their dimension of eternal darkness. But they've learned to fear the rainbow makers, the light splitters, the guardians who know their true nature. And in homes across the city, prisms hang in windows, catching sunlight and splitting it into weapons of spectrum and hope. The antique shop stood at the corner of Maple and Pine, its weathered facade a testament to decades of business in our small town. I had passed by it hundreds of times before, but that autumn afternoon, something drew me inside. Perhaps it was the peculiar mirror propped in the window display, its gilded frame catching the dying sunlight in a way that made the glass seem to ripple like disturbed water. A bell chimed softly as I pushed open the door, stirring dust motes that danced in the slanting rays of light. The shop's interior was a maze of forgotten treasures, tarnished silverware, moth-eaten tapestries, and furniture that belonged to another century. But my eyes were fixed on that mirror. "Ah, you've noticed our newest acquisition," came a voice from behind a towering bookshelf. The shopkeeper emerged, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and paper-thin skin. "Quite a remarkable piece, isn't it?" I nodded, approaching the mirror. Up close, I could see that the glass wasn't perfectly smooth. There was a hairline crack running diagonally across its surface, so fine it was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. "Where did it come from?" I asked, reaching out to touch the frame. The old man's hand shot out, catching my wrist before my fingers could make contact. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Best not to touch it directly," he said, releasing me with an apologetic smile. "It's quite delicate. As for its origin, it came from the Victoria Manor estate sale last month. You know the place?" Everyone knew Victoria Manor. The sprawling Victorian mansion had stood empty for 30 years, ever since the tragic death of its last inhabitant, a young woman who had lived there alone. Local legends said she had gone mad, though no one seemed to know the details. "How much?" I heard myself ask, though I hadn't planned on buying anything. "For you? $200. He named a price far lower than what such an ornate piece should have commanded. "But I must warn you, it comes with certain conditions." I should have asked what he meant. I should have walked away. But something about my reflection in that cracked glass held me transfixed. My features seemed somehow sharper, more angular in its surface, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move in the background, though I was alone in front of the mirror. "I'll take it," I said. The shopkeeper insisted on having it delivered, rather than letting me carry it myself. "Better not to handle it more than necessary," he said, writing up the receipt. As I turned to leave, he caught my arm again. "One more thing, never look into it at midnight. And if you hear humming coming from it, cover it immediately." I laughed, thinking he was adding to the ambience of the sale. "Anything else I should know?" His expression remained grave. "Yes, if you see her, don't speak to her. No matter what she says or does, don't engage." "See who?" But he had already disappeared back among the shelves, leaving me alone with my receipt and a growing sense of unease. The mirror was delivered that evening, just as the sun was setting. The delivery men positioned it exactly where I wanted it, on the wall opposite my bed in my small apartment. As they left, one of them muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd wake sometimes, thinking I heard soft humming, but when I opened my eyes, there was only silence. The crack in the glass seemed to change position slightly depending on the light, but I told myself it was just my imagination. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I woke to the sound of humming, not the vague suggestion of it that I'd been hearing, but a clear, sweet melody that made my skin crawl. The digital clock on my nightstand read 11:58 p.m. The mirror's surface appeared to be moving, rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by rain. I should have covered it then. I should have remembered the shopkeeper's warning. Instead, I sat up in bed, watching as the minutes ticked by. At exactly midnight, the humming stopped, and that's when I saw her. She stood in the mirror, but not in my room, a young woman in a white nightgown, her long dark hair hanging in wet strands around her face. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets, but somehow I knew she was looking at me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch as she lifted one pale hand and pressed it against the glass from her side. The crack in the mirror began to spread, creating a web-like pattern that spread from her touch. "Let me out," she whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. "It's so cold in here, so dark. Won't you help me?" I remembered the shopkeeper's warning, don't engage, don't speak to her. But as I watched, a tear of blood rolled from one of those empty sockets. "Please," she begged. "I've been alone so long." My throat went dry. Who are you?" Her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too full of teeth. "Someone who trusted her reflection once. Just like you're doing now." The crack in the mirror spread further, and I could hear it creaking, straining. Her fingers began to push through the glass, breaking through into my world. Blood dripped from where the sharp edges cut into her pale flesh, but she kept pushing. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward my bedroom door. The temperature in the room had dropped so drastically I could see my breath. "You spoke to me," she said, her voice now coming from both the mirror and somewhere behind me. "Now you have to let me in. Those are the rules." I ran. Behind me, I heard the sound of shattering glass and bare feet on hardwood floor. The humming began again, closer now, right behind me. I burst out of my apartment into the hallway, not even bothering to close the door behind me. The humming followed, echoing off the walls, somehow coming from every direction at once. My neighbors' doors remained firmly shut despite my frantic pounding. Either they couldn't hear my cries for help, or they were too terrified to respond. The emergency exit sign at the end of the hall flickered, and in that strobing red light, I saw her reflection in the window. She was closer now, her nightgown dripping water that left dark stains on the carpet. With each step she took, the lights dimmed, as if she was drawing the electricity from them. I took the stairs two at a time, nearly falling in my panic. For flights down, I crashed through the lobby doors into the street. The autumn night was cold, but nothing compared to the Arctic chill that radiated from her presence. My bare feet slapped against the wet pavement as I ran, with no destination in mind except away. But every window I passed, every car mirror, every puddle on the ground, she was there, getting closer each time I glimpsed her. The crack that had been in the mirror now seemed to be spreading across every reflective surface in my path, spiderwebbing outward like ice forming on a pond. "You can't run from your reflection," her voice whispered, seeming to come from inside my own head now. "Everyone tries. They all think they can escape what the mirror shows them." I found myself running toward the antique shop, though I knew it would be closed at this hour. Maybe the old man would help me. Maybe he knew how to stop this. The shop's windows were dark, but as I approached, I saw lights flicker to life inside. Not the warm glow of electric bulbs, but the cold blue illumination of moonlight reflecting off countless mirrors, all of them cracked in exactly the same way as mine. And in each one, I saw her. Dozens of versions of her, all reaching out, all smiling that terrible smile. But they weren't identical. In some she appeared younger, in others older. In some, her nightgown was pristine. In others, it was torn and bloodied. Only those black, empty eye sockets remained constant. The shop door was unlocked. I hurried inside, the bell's cheerful chime now sounding like a funeral toll. "Hello?" I called out. "Please, I need help." "He can't help you," she said, her voice now coming from every mirror in the shop. "He never could. He just collects us. Watches as we add to our numbers, one reflection at a time. What do you want from me?" She laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Want? I want what was taken from me. I want to see again. I want to feel again." All of her reflections moved in unison, stepping closer to their glass barriers. "I want what every trapped thing wants, to be free." "I don't understand," I said, backing away until I hit a wall. "What happened to you?" "The same thing that's about to happen to you." Her voice was almost gentle now. I looked too long into a broken mirror. I spoke to the girl I saw there. And then I became her. She was fully out of the mirror now, standing in the shop with me. Water pooled around her bare feet, and I realized it wasn't water at all. It was dark, thick, and smelled of copper. But why? Why do this to others? Because misery loves company? She tilted her head, dark hair sliding across her face. Because I'm lonely? Because I can? She took another step toward me. Or maybe because that's just what we are, reflections of humanity's darkness, trapped behind glass until someone foolish enough comes along and lets us out. And then we need somewhere else to go. I felt something cold and wet touch my hand. Looking down, I saw that same dark liquid seeping from the wall behind me. No, not from the wall, from another mirror, one I hadn't noticed before. My reflection in it was wrong, distorted. As I watched, horror struck. My eyes in the reflection began to darken, to empty out. "Time to trade places," she whispered, right next to my ear now. "Time for you to see what it's like on the other side of the glass." I tried to pull away from the mirror, but my reflection reached out and grabbed my wrist. The grip was impossibly strong, pulling me forward. The glass surface had become liquid, cold and thick like oil, and I was sinking into it. "Please," I begged, not sure if I was talking to her or to my own reflection. "Please don't do this." "Shoo," she soothed, pushing me further into the mirror. "It won't hurt. Nothing hurts in here. Nothing feels anything at all." The last thing I saw in the real world was her face, suddenly whole again, eyes restored and bright with triumph. Then the darkness of the mirror closed over me like water over a drowning person's head. Now I stand behind the glass, watching as she walks away in my body, wearing my life like a new dress. I'm not alone here. I can sense the others, countless reflections trapped in this dark dimension between mirrors. Sometimes we catch glimpses of the living world, fragments of lives continuing without us. And sometimes someone stops to look too long at their reflection in a broken mirror. They lean in close, fascinated by the subtle wrongness of what they see. And we whisper to them, invite them to look closer, to speak to us. After all, misery loves company, and the crack in the mirror is spreading.